What do we predict would happen if there was cut funding to sex education in schools? What would be the result? What would occur if there was no sex education in schools, at least not taxpayer funded? What would we predict the result would be? What most leftists, liberals, statists, even those on the right who are statists, would predict is that if the state was not funding these programs for sex education in schools, whether it's abstinence-based or whatever, that if it was not responsible for this, there would be an increase in teenage pregnancy. Seems kind of to make sense. But interesting article on contraception came out on June 5th. Talks about how teen pregnancy rates fall. I'll read the percentage in a second. After UK cuts sex ed birth control funding. This is a study. So a study came out, and the name of the study was The Effect of Spending Cuts on Teen Pregnancy. So what happens when there are spending cuts? What happens as far as teen pregnancy? And I'll just give you the punchline of this right now. Teen pregnancy in the UK, limited areas, and we may not know exactly why yet, but teen pregnancy, according to this study, in the UK, after sex ed birth control funding was cut, teen pregnancy fell by 42.6%. This is from Sheffield, England. It says a new study indicates that teen pregnancy rates drop when liberal sex ed funding is cut. This study analyzed the results of the data in England before and after contraceptive-based sex ed expenditures were slashed. So they had to make these cuts, and these cuts are, of course, criticized by people. The reason why there's so much teen pregnancy is because of a lack of education and a lack of access to contraceptives, especially among the poor. And so doing this is against the poor. It's controlling. It's trying to control the sex lives of poor people and women and socioeconomically disadvantaged people by cutting taxes to this tax money to these areas. Researchers in the Journal of Health Economics looked into this. And so after England is forced to make some pretty tough budget cuts, it cuts, among other things, tax funds for sex ed in school and giving out free birth control. Okay, so those things are cut. What's the result after it's cut? So they did the study to examine what the impact would be on the reductions of those, the reduction of that spending in that area, and if more teen pregnancy, what would be the effect on teen pregnancy? The result: the Patton and Wright research team used statistics from 149 municipalities between 2009 and 2014 and found that after sex ed budgets were cut, teen pregnancy rates fell by 42.6%. Cutting sex ed budgets had a strong correlation to lower teen pregnancy. And this isn't a study of one school. This is 149 municipalities over time for 5 years. And so the researchers figured out that taking away this tax funding for the contraceptive-focused sex education in schools brought teen pregnancy down, did not increase it. The study goes on to say, contrary to predictions made at the time of the cuts, panel data estimates provide no evidence that areas which reduced expenditures the most have experienced relative increases in teenage pregnancy rates. Rather, expenditure rates are associated with small reductions in teen pregnancy rates. So instead of them going up, they're going down, contrary to the expectations of the time. We talk about the changing times and the changing morals and the changes since the sexual revolution and all this. But now teen pregnancies in England are the lowest they have been since 1969. Since 1969, after the cutting of sex education and free contraceptives in schools. So the statistics show teen pregnancy rates diminish the most in those areas where secular sex ed budgets were most aggressively cut, meaning the most secular, the most based on just education and safe sex. By the way, the only safe sex is in marriage. But the ones who did not say that, the ones who did not teach abstinence, the ones who said that we're not going to waste our time with abstinence, we're just going to talk about safe sex and contraceptives, and not only tell you about these things, but we're going to give you the contraceptives, that where those were most aggressively cut, those had the strongest connections between reductions in teen pregnancy. Now, why is this happening? There could be several reasons why this is happening, but the authors of this study, and looking at their data, suggest, quote, underlying socioeconomic factors such as education outcomes and alcohol consumptions are found to be significant predictors of teen pregnancy. Okay, so they connect it to alcohol and socioeconomic conditions, but we've been told all this time that unwanted pregnancies would be reduced by quote-unquote safe sex instruction in public schools, and us paying for that and paying for the contraceptive care of others. And by the way, this is what people are always saying. They have those videos about, oh, men can't have any opinion on abortion. Men need to get out of the discussion as far as abortion because it's about a woman. He's getting involved in her right. Well, when you invite the government in and demand that people pay for it through their tax money, then the government's going to discuss it. And the government, for better or worse, is made up of men who have been brought into this area. And it's the same with sex ed funding and free contraceptives. People always say they pretend they want more sexual freedom. Get the government out of my sex life. Oh, you shouldn't have anything to say about my sex life. Culture shouldn't have anything to say about my sex life. Religion shouldn't have anything to say about my sex life. But you will pay for my contraceptive care. You will pay for my sex ed education. Even if you disagree with it morally, ethically, factually, you will pay for it. But you have no right to forward your worldview through the government, even though that's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, how do people justify the arguments for sex ed now? If this is the case, and this needs some further study for sure, this is just England, so who knows, or just the UK. But if this is true, if this is a predictable result, how can you justify the arguments for sex ed education if it actually has the possibility of increasing unwanted pregnancies among teenagers? Because this is not going to matter. This is not going to be the changing factor that people say, oh, you know what, I guess I was incorrect about sex ed funding and free contraceptives paid for by the taxpayer. We should take a different approach or not have that in schools at all. No one's going to follow that logic. But even though the result is counterproductive, how is this justified? People talk about education in this area is so necessary, and this is the thing that's going to stop unwanted pregnancies, and that they don't have access to contraceptive care, and that it needs to be provided for them. I mean, goes back to my question, can education be neutral? This is what, like it or not, agree with it or not, you are being forced to pay for through your taxes. You are being forced to pay for the service of someone else's education. That may very well include sex education that you do not agree with and would not teach to your own children or anybody else's children. And you're paying for these contraceptives for people to engage in activities you may agree with or not. Can education be neutral? I mean, people scoff at the idea of taxes for someone else's religion, but we're having taxes for the civil religion of public education, which not only teaches sex ed that most people, that not most, but many people may disagree with, for apparently good reasons, and pays for their contraceptive care. I mean, a church at least, not that any that I know of, or any type of religion, at least isn't demanding that the government pay for the sexual activity of its members. But that's exactly what public education does and is doing in many cases. How is that justified? So this has been claimed for decades that we need safe sex instruction and contraceptives paid for by the taxpayer, distributed to teenage girls, especially because they're the ones who are going to have to deal with an unwanted pregnancy. But in 1999, after 3 decades, 30 years of sex ed, England had one of the highest rates of teenage pregnancy in Europe. So after all this sex ed and free contraceptives paid for by the taxpayer, which we were told were going to reduce teen pregnancy, after 30 years of that, England does not go down in teen pregnancies. It doesn't even stay static with no change at all, but it actually increases and becomes one of the highest areas in Europe as far as teen pregnancy is concerned. Their conclusion, and this may be more complicated than this, but Patton and Wright, their research, it said, showed that government programs actually increase teen pregnancies. They certainly don't reduce them. And thereby increase abortion, other issues involved. I mean, only government could fail this fantastically. Only government can fail this epically, getting the opposite result of what it seeks to do, not admit it's wrong, not make any correction, keep pursuing that path of failure, and not be changed. You cannot do that in the free market. You cannot do that anywhere else. Only government can continue to fail that spectacularly. And still, we all seek to justify it as if that's a normal thing. And this shows it's counterproductive. The authors of this study concluded the birth control will reduce the risk of pregnancy for sex acts which would have occurred anyway, but may increase the risk among teenagers who are induced by easier access to birth control, either to start having sex or have sex more frequently. Because that's what we've been told. Us people who are on the religious right, that's what we've been had thrown at us. Well, no, we can't talk about abstinence. I mean, why do you have to talk about sex at school at all? Why should the school, the place of education, be the place where sex is brought in to talk to students? There may be some justification for that, but we ought to ask the question. As if this is normal. How did people learn about sex before the U.S. public school and education system? Well, they're just going to have sex anyway. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. They're not all just going to have sex anyway. I mean, we're told this by our sexualized culture that has been so influenced by the sexual revolution that has so normalized the idea that to be a teenager means, by definition, to be sexually active, when in many cases that is not the norm. That is not the norm in many cases taught by parents to their children. But that's what we've always been told, is that, well, they're just going to do it anyway, so I'd rather them do it safely and then not have an unwanted pregnancy or a sexually transmitted disease. Well, it didn't work. And when funding in that area was cut, unwanted pregnancies decreased 42.6% in the UK. What they failed to realize is that handing out contraceptives for free, talking about sex, bringing up these ideas in a way that may be good, it may not be, may increase. So there are going to be those who do it anyway. Okay, fine. That's up to them. They have to make that economic choice. They have to make that religious choice. They have to make that individual personal choice. And if they're going to do it anyway, then no amount of education, contraceptive care, or whatever you're going to try to throw at them is going to change their mind. If they're just going to do it anyway, then you have no control over that, no matter what government policy you bring in. The government policies are just going to affect everybody else. So for those who wouldn't have been doing that anyway, they may be induced. Hey, I have easier access to free birth control now. Communicating possibly to them that there are no consequences. That birth control is easier to get. You've made it free and induced demand. I mean, when something gets cheaper, an increased supply gets cheaper, the price is lower, that increases demand. It's an economic principle. And so you've got the people you may be inducing now to sexual activity, giving them contraceptive care, which is obviously not 100% effective. And then you have those who maybe are sexually active, but are encouraged now by the same economic factors, by increasing of that demand and inducing that demand, to start having sex more frequently than they already were, increasing teen pregnancy. When it was cut, it goes away. Not goes away, but is reduced. I mean, this is comparable to the DARE program in schools that sought to educate young teenagers about drugs, try to scare them away from it. but actually the bringing in of outsiders to educate people about drugs, showing them exactly what they look like, getting them interested in it, telling them all the effects that these drugs, which could probably be fairly easily found, all the effects that this would have on their mind and body, did not work in decreasing the amount of people who were doing drugs. The DARE program itself admitted in a study that it was an abject failure. For the people who weren't going to be doing drugs anyway, it had no difference. For people who were on the edge, maybe they made a decision. But it didn't help that they were showing them exactly what they looked like and what they would do to their mind and body. And a bunch of people end up doing drugs anyway. So the same factors may be at work here.